we have other discussants there. So Sheila, the presenter has got 15 minutes, and the discussants, each of them has got 5 minutes, so that we'll be able to manage this time and translate, because also we are in curfew hours, and some of us of the participants are away from their homes, and we will need them to return. So Sheila, please take over. You run us through this session, and you keep time. Thank you. You're muted if you are talking, Sheila.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we've all been able to replenish ourselves, possibly grabbed a bite, just to energize ourselves for the afternoon session. I'm privileged to be moderating this first afternoon session on communication, lobbying, and advocacy during the COVID-19 era. And the brief background on this is that dynamic geopolitics and changes in funding structures for think tanks and advances in technology and communication have led to disruptive environments for think tanks. And the fourth industrial revolution has increased the rate of technological changes, reliance on social media and social networks, emergence of artificial intelligence and big data, and increase also in sharing and spreading of information. Now, these disruptions have been, of course, compounded by various factors, including what we are now facing in the face of COVID-19, and have affected the operations and strategic functioning of think tanks, because we know how crises tend to impact how we operate, and also create fertile conditions for reform, because in it there have been opportunities for people to rethink how they live, how they work and do other basic things. And how then do think tanks then need to reinvent themselves, including changing how they design and develop their policy agenda, how they engage other policy actors, even politicians and citizens, how they identify, and nab windows of opportunities, how they lobby and advocate for policy influence. So to help us just really think and assess how think tanks can ensure that their advocacy roles and initiatives respond to current global issues, so that the policies and policy proposals that are developed can be impactful and improve livelihoods, we're going to have this session, and also aimed at just espousing on the skills and measures that as think tanks we need to remain committed to preserving ourselves, to continue to operate, continue to create and generate knowledge and use this knowledge while also demonstrating progress. So with me this afternoon, I'm very privileged to be to moderate Dr. Frida Njogu, who will be our main presenter for this afternoon. Dr. Njogu is the East Africa Regional Director for IDinsight, which is based in Nairobi. And IDinsight is a global advisory, data analytics, and research organization, which has used data and evidence tools, including randomized evaluations and machine learning, to help decision makers to design effective programs and rigorously test what works to support communities. IDinsight works with governments, multilaterals, foundations, and innovative and non-profit organizations in Asia and Africa across a wide range of sectors, including agriculture, education, health, governance, sanitation, and financial inclusion, and has various offices across the world, including Nairobi. Frida, by profession, is a medical doctor, a public health specialist, an entrepreneur, and a development and management consultant. So I'll welcome her to join, and then we have two discussants. That is Mr. Kwame Owino, he's a Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya, and also we have Mr. Kevin Bwire, a program officer with the Institute of Social Accountability, and I will introduce them at the point they come in to speak. So first we'll have the 15-minute presentation by Dr. Frida, and then after that we'll open it to the two discussants. And because this is supposed to be a very interactive and open discussion, I will also encourage all our participants to let us continue to be interactive, share your ideas, that rich exchange of ideas that we've had all day. Let us continue to have that. So I welcome your input on the chat as the session is ongoing, but we'll have an opportunity to open up the session to the plenary once the presentation and input of the discussants is received. I now want to welcome Dr. Frida, please. Please come take the mic. Mic is yours, the screen is yours to be able to share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you. I'm really privileged to have this opportunity to come and talk to us today. My name is Frida Njogu. I'm the regional director for East Africa at IDinsight, as Sheila has very well introduced me. And I won't go too much into introducing us, except maybe just to say that IDinsight again is a non-profit advisory, data analytics, and research firm that uses data and evidence to help leaders worldwide combat poverty to achieve social impact. I want to share my deck. I hope I'll be able to. Let me try. I don't know if it's visible.
Not visible yet.
Okay, let me try that again. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is visible. Dr. Njogu, please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. So today we are talking about how we can contribute to building back better in the wake of the devastation that COVID-19 has wreaked, both economically and socially. And I've been asked to talk about communication, advocacy, and lobbying, and this is in a context where we have a lot of information, this information overload, both with the public, but also even among ourselves. And also, in addition to the information overload, we have a lot of fake, or misinformation that is affecting, how we do life generally. And I'm thinking, as I think in terms of, policymakers, I think that policymakers have two significant challenges in this season. One is to deal with the fear and misinformation that the public has that affects how they interact with, interventions, and advice. For instance, in this time of COVID, we've seen how, misinformation around masking, especially in the US, has affected, really the trajectory of the COVID pandemic. But even closer home, right here, we have a lot of misinformation, especially around the COVID vaccine. And so the policymakers need to figure out how to communicate over all this noise so that they are heard and that the public will trust them. That's one. Two, policymakers also have to make difficult policy decisions. I'm particularly empathetic with our Ministry of Education here in Kenya, that has to decide, do we open schools, do we keep them closed? And this is, you have to think about, public health reasons, in case of outbreaks. But on the other hand, how about the impact on education of millions of children? Last year we had a pandemic of, I call it an epidemic of teenage pregnancies because girls are at home. Just things like those competing, voices from civil society, interest groups, teachers saying, we're not safe. And truthfully, we've lost quite a few teachers, parents saying we can't work with the children at home. So the decision makers, for instance, in the Ministry of Education, are faced with a difficult decision, and they need evidence to guide them, while still taking into consideration, all these other inputs from the various interested groups. And I think, they particularly need the help of, people such as ourselves, think tanks, research and advisory firms, to both provide the correct information to the public, as well as to make, the right decisions. And, so we, those think tanks and research firms and all, are able to actually, look at available evidence or collect even new evidence. For instance, in this case, evidence on why people are not taking the vaccine, or, the possible impact of school closures, et cetera, et cetera. So we're able to look at available or collect new evidence, we're able to synthesize it, and condense it into actionable data and recommendations that policymakers can use. We have to be very good at translating our research into action through good communication. Yeah, good communication, good advocacy, and persuasion. And I mean, we could talk about how to communicate effectively, but I won't. I mean, I think in terms of how to package our information based on the audience, level of technical detail, what channels to use to reach various policymakers, should we use multiple channels, publication, media, etc., etc. But I don't want to focus on that, on the how of communicating or the how of advocacy. I want to focus on a different question. Why? Why should policy or decision makers listen to us? I mean, they've got all these other interest groups. They've got, voters who are telling them, move in this direction. There's all this information. Why should they listen to us? And sometimes what we might recommend might actually be politically expensive for them. And so the fundamental questions for us in this space is, what do we have to offer? And why should they trust us more than any other source? And I just want to propose a few points. So research, relationships, reputation, and relevance. As far as research is concerned, we must continue, or rather we must obtain a high degree of rigor so that our findings are valid and unbiased. I think, this is not something that is new to us, but yeah, so this needs to continue being, front and center. We need to ensure that the recommendations that we are making are actually grounded in evidence, even if we require to actually go and collect that evidence, new evidence as situations evolve, collect evidence on whether, as the Ministry of Education decides, to go into remote learning, do children around the country have access to internet and everything? So our recommendations need to be grounded in evidence. But this we generally tend to do well, and so I won't belabor the point. Research, though, is only just part of the story. The other part is, and probably maybe even a more significant part is reputation, relationships, and relevance. So speaking of, thinking about relationships, at IDinsight, we not only value relationships with top decision makers, we also, tend to cultivate relationships with the technical, experts, the technical levels. So we're talking about the bureaucrats, the implementers, and the others with whom, our teams engage as we do our work. That's one, but we also want to do, and we also tend to engage other stakeholders, develop relationships with other stakeholders around this. We're even thinking of funders, NGOs, civil society, etc., etc. This is not only necessary for us, as we're implementing a particular project, but it's also strategic because it tends to, bear greater impact over time. I'll give an example of some work we've done with the Malawi government, with the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection. We have been having an ongoing, partnership with them where we're providing data and evidence for their social cash transfer program. And then COVID hit last year. And quickly they're able to tell us, you guys, we've worked with you, we know your rigor. Are you able to help us, think through, how to target COVID-19 cash transfers? And there were newly vulnerable people, especially in the urban areas. So we're able to quickly work with them to, think through how to target it and so on. And so we've continued to actually, I think the relationship that we had was what helped us continue to contribute even in this new era. The other thing I want to highlight is that we need to use our expertise, our evidence to help policy decision makers succeed to be effective at their work. So not just in making policy, but in even communicating it more effectively. We talked about, for instance, the example of the vaccine misinformation. Are we able to package and give them talking points? Are we able to package information and give them, say, talking points, give them infographics to communicate with the public, ensure that they have, they're able to communicate in ways that are easily, in formats that are easily digested by the public. The other part of helping them to be successful is just helping them better use their data. I know we've got, this may not necessarily be related to a particular research product, but because we have the capacity, to work with them, to come alongside them and be, thought partners in terms of thinking of things like, analytics and dashboards, so they're continuously able to use whatever evidence is available. I'm just, thinking about some of the work we have been doing in India. We've been having a partnership with the Delhi government. Lately, we've been supporting their COVID-19 work. So among other things, what we were able to do is actually collect information, then help them package to help and communicate it, we help them package it in ways that they could easily communicate to the population, around prevention messages. So that's really another thing that we come alongside them to help them succeed. This is still part of relationship building. Going to reputation, as think tanks, research and advisory firms, we need to, have a reputation of excellence, truth-telling, and commitment to social good, and also to have a reputation of having interest in the societies that we work with or live in. But reputation building is a continuous process, and it has different components. I'll just mention a few of them that I think are important. One of them is how we recruit. For instance, at IDinsight, and I'm sure in many research firms, we tend to, in most research firms and think tanks, we need to have a reputation of filling research positions with people who are members of specific scientific or academic, professional communities, people who are, their work is trusted, and then also supporting them to continue to build their profession, to develop professionally. Two, we also need to have a reputation for independence. And this cuts both ways. I mean, so even if you're a government think tank and you're funded from the exchequer, again, always maintaining professional independence. On the other hand, if you're, private sector player, for instance, such as ourselves, and we are funded by funders with, diverse leanings, we still need to ensure that the work that we produce is speaking for itself. It is not swayed by what the funder has to say. And related to this is really transparency in funding, especially with foreign funds. We need to ensure that we are careful whose voice we are elevating. We are not pushing an external agenda that tends then to influence the kind of recommendations that we make. The other thing around reputation is also, a reputation for communicating the work. Which work do we share? Do we have publication biases? Are we publishing only what we think we wanted to say, and the researchers show us differently and not then published? So I think the other thing I think around reputation is also just how we amplify each other's work as think tanks and research firms and advisory firms, that we can actually help amplify each other's work. Maybe on to my last point around relevance. So at IDinsight, we are not keen to push. We don't want to be seen to push, we don't want to push or to be seen to push our own agenda. In fact, when we come to the table, we generally have no agenda. Our only agenda is social impact. But what we want to know is what are the policymaker evidence or data needs, and then we go ahead and provide those, provide that data and evidence that is required, and of course ensure that we actually tell it as it is, not massage it. So we need things that we need to think about in terms of whose questions are we answering. Are they the questions that are top on the mind of policymakers and so on and so forth? We're talking about demand-driven evidence, and we know that demand-driven evidence is the one that tends to be used more, as opposed to supply-driven evidence. The other thing I wanted to think about is in terms of the constraints. Are we aware of the constraints of the policymakers, such that then we are able to adapt our tools to their constraints or adapt our plans without compromising the scientific rigor? So we're thinking in terms of being aware of their budgets, time, and others. And speaking about time, being aware of the policy cycles and timing the completion of our research to coincide with those policy cycles, so that we benefit the process as opposed to releasing the research after. Yeah, so when we, in my opinion, when we actually, are ensuring that we're answering, their questions, we are aware of their constraints, we are, releasing the information when they need it, and so on and so forth. Then, and of course, the other things I've talked about in terms of relationships and reputation, then we have a much higher chance of having our work influence, decisions and policy. So I didn't talk about how to communicate. Let me stop sharing. I did not talk about how to communicate, how to package our information. But I wanted to just, trigger a discussion about how we can be the trusted advisor, because that's really what ensures that our work is done. So thank you very much. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Njogu. That was a very good use of time, but still very able to communicate to us on this critical issue on, communicating, lobbying, and advocacy in the era of COVID-19. How do we really make use of this data and evidence that we are generating to be able to influence change? And I really like your exemplification of, and trying to respond to some of those fundamental questions. And what are we offering as think tanks? Why should, policymakers and others we're targeting trust us more than any other source? I mean, there's a lot of information out there. And I like what you have as the 4 R's, research, making sure that our findings are valid, same to the recommendations. I think actually speaking to the issue around, integrity of the data, you've talked about the issue about, relationships, whose agenda we're pushing, will our tools really help the policymakers to succeed in their work? And then another critical question on reputation. And I think from there, the main point I got was, who are the people behind the research? How are we recruiting? Are we independent? And then I think the last point you shared was on relevance. I especially like that question you have posed on, do our time frames reflect the policy cycle, so that what we are generating, is it relevant, at that particular point? Because I think sometimes when you look at some of the gaps in this arena, is sometimes we're good at giving solutions, and so sometimes maybe not setting the agenda, but being a bit more reactive. So critical to also think about our time frame. Are we really reflecting the policy cycle? I think at this point, I want to welcome our first discussant. And our first discussant is Mr. Kevin Bwire from the Institute of Social Accountability. He's just giving his feedback and any other thoughts, inputs on what Dr. Frida has been able to share with us, and basically just give us any additional information, based on his own experience and also expertise. And I also just want to remind you that, again, we're encouraging you to be interactive, keep posting your comments or thoughts as they come on the chat. Introduce Mr. Bwire. He's a program officer at the Institute of Social Accountability. He sees the socioeconomic inclusion program, and really seeks to champion and realize. There's someone's mic is on. Please put off your mic so that we are able to hear the speakers. Thank you very much.
Sheila, you're muted, please.
I don't know at what point I was muted. What have you missed?
Up to the time that you are actually expounding the last bit. You can start from there.
Okay, I think I just gave an overview of Dr. Frida's presentation, particularly focusing on the 4 R's that she had shared. And I just jumped into also give my introduction to Mr. Kevin Bwire, who will be our first discussant, also sharing his insights and any other additional information to the presentation that Dr. Frida has given us on the issue around communication, lobbying, and advocacy during this COVID-19 time. He's going to draw from his experience and expertise from TISA. TISA, that is the Institute of Social Accountability, is an organization that has been in existence since 2008, whose aim has been to promote citizen empowerment and government accountability. And I think they've done a lot of work, particularly in terms of social accountability, just to empower citizens to be able to demand sound delivery of services by holding their leaders to account. And I think for many of us, we've seen their work in regard to devolution and also enforcing accountability in public finance management, particularly the issue around public debt. But I will let Kevin, he's a program officer in charge of socioeconomic inclusion program at TISA, which seeks to champion and realize inclusion of the vulnerable groups, particularly the youth and women informal women informal traders in Kenya. I will welcome him to give his feedback, because he also coordinates research and fundraising activities at TISA, maybe from his own point of view, having been responsible for research in TISA, maybe also share how they are channeling the data and evidence that they are gathering into and communicating and using this to lobby for in the critical areas that they are addressing in their work. Kevin, I open the mic to you, and you have 5 minutes for a start. Then you can be able to engage more during the plenary. Kevin, please take the mic.
Okay, thank you, Sheila, for the introduction. My name is Kevin Gwire, as I've been introduced earlier, and I'm a program officer at TISA, particularly focusing on the socioeconomic inclusion program. Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. And from where we stand as TISA, the COVID pandemic has just revolutionized how the CSOs work, and we need to be on toes on how we're able to design and develop the policy agenda, because it starts from the inception. Which stakeholders are you looking at? Do you plan with the beneficiaries? How accountable are you, and how regular do you reach out to your donors? And what are the policy target institutions do you work with? So in terms of having relationships and then ensuring there's a clear two-track way how information is able to flow from the organization to the policy people, and of course reaching in between to all the stakeholders that are affected by the policy suggestions the organization stands for. For start, research is very key, and assessment. And by research, I mean just the topical research. Because initially, as TISA, we had our programs, but with the advent of the pandemic, you had to halt it and then see how can we respond. So the first thing we did early March last year was to do a rapid assessment study to see how the government measures with regard to curbing COVID have affected the informal traders, particularly the youth, women, and persons with disabilities. And we sought out to identify what opportunities are these people using to cope, because their working hours have been reduced, and in environments where they work, they are not able to social distance. So what challenges are they facing, and what can government then take from that so that they're able to come up with inclusive policy recommendations to be able to push on them? So some of the challenges we noted in the ground were that there was no clear channel on how the government was consulting the individuals that are affected. And some of the suggestions were then to work through their representatives to be able to identify those who are really affected and see how they can be able to channel assistance through that platform. So the other aspect on picking up the lobbying and communication and accountability issues was to identify various CSOs who are working on different issues. So you put them together in a consortia, and you're able to engage on their respective comparative advantage. So here we were able to, for instance, TISA was focusing on the informal traders. TI at some point were focusing on the procurements in the health sector. And we were able to identify these issues, and we had periodical meetings, like weekly, just to update on each other and see how we can take this forward. Yes, so the other aspect was on maybe just on fundraising. We also did a social accountability study last year that was commissioned by the Danish International Development Agency, just to assess how the CSO programs have been revolutionizing the civil society space. And some of the challenges were some CSOs were a bit hesitant on confronting government. So they're able to take a measured approach, just not to be labeled as adversarial. And these, in real sense, could still contribute negatively to increasing the shrinking civic space that's being experienced not only in Kenya, but in the region. So on how to go about this, then the suggestions were to identify the key policy targets and then be able to forge relationships with them. So we were able to be part of the COG. And when they're coming up with the devolution conference that didn't happen last year, we had a segment on environment, how they can be able to have the socioeconomic inclusion programs that include the women, the youth, so that they're able to benefit in terms of livelihoods and also have a sustainable and clean environment. So we also managed to reach out to Makueni County government, where we were able to start implementing a program which did not materialize because we had to halt it, but we're still in communication with them, and we are scoping for fundraising opportunities to be able to take this effort to the next level. So in terms of challenges we saw to realize, you know, sometimes when you're engaging as CSOs within the consortium, there are those time constraints, because CSOs before COVID had some aspects they're working on, and they decided to take the topical issue on accountability. So that might be treated as a secondary. And then the risk with that, we might fail to come up with the policy suggestions to inform the government response in time. And so that the work might be, you know, you might be presenting findings after the government has taken a certain stance, and that could be a bit problematic. So the other challenge is, like, when you're consolidating a number of CSOs, it's really hard for you to be out of the planning step. You notice you might spend more time in the planning other than just implementing. So yeah, so thank you so much. I look forward to share some additional insights, and I leave this floor back to the moderator, maybe the second discussant, so you can be able to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for those insights from the Institute of Social Accountability, just being able to share how you were able to quickly adapt to the new norm last year following COVID, and even just how you were able to, you know, refashion your work so that you're able to respond to the demands at that point related to issues around COVID-19, and also how you've been able to channel them towards policy advocacy. At this point, I want to invite the other discussant, and that is Mr. Kwame Owino, so that we can take his input together with Mr. Bwire's, and going back to the main presentation to be able to engage further in the plenary. Mr. Kwame Owino is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. And I think many of us know IEA. It has been the leading think tank and a premier organization in regard to the, just sharing and giving us a platform for informed discussions in regard to the economy, and has been able to influence public policy in Kenya. IEA has sought to promote pluralism of ideas through open, active, and informed debate on public policy issues, and I think has undertaken a lot of research and also public education and sensitization on key economic and topical issues in public affairs in Kenya and the region. And I think many of us are quite appreciative of the role that IEA has played in terms of giving us key information to be able to engage on critical issues around touching on the economy and also public finance management. Kwame has led research and policy dialogue in economic regulation and competition policy, and has also had diverse interests in economic regulation and public sector reform, and has been instrumental in overseeing research in IEA Kenya's key policy areas on public expenditure, revenue analysis, international trade, economic regulation, devolution, and the use of futures methodologies to inform public affairs in Kenya. I would say that Kwame is a well-renowned household name in Kenya in regard to the economy and public finance management, and we are very, very privileged to have him in this session to also be able to give his insights around that topic on communicating, lobbying, and advocacy in regard to COVID-19, especially during this in this current context. I see he's already on. So Kwame, the mic is yours. Please give us your insights. Karibu sana.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheila, and thanks for the kind introduction for both the IEA and for myself. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I have 5 minutes. And what I'm supposed to speak about is just basically, I'll try and pitch this on the basis of how does the IEA approach this. And I have to give credit to the fact that it was anchored around a new paradigm which talks about the 4 Rs, which is research, relationships, reputation, and relevance. And I mean, at the risk of looking repetitive, one of the things we have to say is that, yes, I think the very idea of a think tank engaging in communication, broad communication, and you can communicate with two sets of people. One is the general public, which might involve professionals and lay people, and the other, of course, are policymakers on the one side. And it takes different things to make sure that you can have influence or inform or just be part of a broader discussion for each of those. So there's a convergence, but there are other places in which there isn't. The one thing that is shared completely in all of them is that you must have at least evidence. And that evidence has to be something that is unimpeachable or even verifiable, in the sense that, look, if you're making the claim that under COVID-19, this number of students were unable to return to school because of, one, they either went to work, two, through some unfortunate circumstances, some might have become pregnant, and often people will ask for us to think of this as an important question so that it doesn't look like it's the usual moral panic. Where is the data? So I think the issue that, research, all policy communication is hinged on research, which basically every audience wants to be able to tell. So I think sometimes the public can make do with the top line questions about the vulnerability of girls, of young children. Let me just talk about children, schoolboys and schoolgirls, which is real, but also at the same time, when you go to decision makers, they need to say, okay, fine, if you're going to try and solve this problem, what is the extent of the problem? And what are some of the ways we can use to actually make sure that we have a cost-effective response? And that cost-effective response can only be designed if there's evidence and data of what the extent and what the real problem is. So that definitely is. I think relationships also are built, are essential. So obviously, as was explained, your credibility also matters. And so bringing information is important, but if your credibility must be brought into the game, it means that obviously people will take seriously or will consider the options that you give against others by virtue of the fact that you have proven credible before, or what you are stating is not only measured, but it's also supported by the evidence. Of course, reputation, I think it's also gained over time, and that shows us that as think tanks, part of what we try to do, because we are in the policy research, generating knowledge, dispersing that knowledge, so obviously reputation matters. And I think sometimes reputation matters for institutions plus the individuals who run those institutions. And then I think that relevance is important, but part of one of the other things that we've determined as think tanks is, so for instance, the example of the Institute of Economic Affairs was that we have specific lenses, and Sheila mentioned the 4 policy areas in which we work. And in the last 4 or 5 years, one of the things the IE has been concerned about in terms of just using evidence is the fact that the government of Kenya had such tight finances because of the public, because of deficits, which led to an accumulation of debt. And our fear is what came to happen last year, in the sense that there was very little headroom for the government of Kenya to respond if we should have a crisis, like what happened last year. And so, so some of these are not just relevance, but you know that if you carry out research that is based on verifiable information, and if you can see some of those trend lines over time, then even if the thing is not relevant immediately, or is not considered relevant immediately, but the accumulation of all the factors in terms of your reputation build, the data that you bring to the discussion, and obviously you've understood an issue or follow the topic for a while, gives you the facility to respond and see, okay, this is what would happen. And that's part of the reason that the government of Kenya tried its best, but could not execute a huge stimulus program last year, was already that there's just no room. There's no headroom for new spending. One of the other things that, so I'll mention 2 things before I close. So I think that paradigm is fantastic, and thanks a lot for bringing it to our attention. Because it prevents a very nice paradigm for looking at all these other things so that we can sort it out as you look at what says, okay, how's our research? What's the quality of our relationships, the reputation, and is the issue that we are bringing before the public for communication, either with the audience that makes decisions or the others relevant or not. Now, what I am circumspect about is that it's true that as a think tank, the IEA though is an association, so we have members. So part of our outlays are paid for by the members who are mostly Kenyans. 98% of our members are Kenyan, so they pay a subscription. So partly our voice comes from the fact that we have a platform for members to discuss policy. But what I think sometimes is unfair is the idea that unless, whose voice, for instance, do you carry? The question of authenticity of voice is one that I have revised my view about. So for instance, if you come to, and the IEA is completely transparent about who funds us, where our resources come from, and how we spend them. But one of the things that I think is a pushback that we need as think tanks is basically that, look, the authenticity of voice is not necessarily directly related to who funds you. Why? Because if your research is verifiable, then I don't think somebody should ask me to question my voice about who funds me. What they should ask me to say is that the knowledge and the information that you're presenting and the interpretations that you're giving, have you declared any assumptions that you have made? So for instance, as the IEA, in many things, we make the assumption that market conditions, transparent conditions, and constitutional principles are the best way to govern public affairs. So if that is a bias, we bring that bias into our research and into our policy prescriptions, and it's important for people to understand. Now, whether that makes for an authentic voice or not is for people to judge, but I think that we must push back, and I specifically push back on the idea that is an idea was developed by a think tank in the US, or it's an academic paper that's come from the US. If we use its content, then somehow it's less valid because it's not Kenyan. I think one of the things that we accept is there's no such thing as ethnic epistemology. The fact of balanced budgets is not relevant because it's Kenyan or not. I think it becomes relevant and authentic because arithmetic works. I mean, the laws of mathematics work irrespective of whether you're in the US, whether you're in Myanmar, whether you're in Canada, or whether you're in Kenya. So I think that authenticity is essential. But I don't know that it is actually something that would make one policy bad or not. I think it helps when, as a Kenyan, you are negotiating or speaking to Kenyan policymakers. It helps. But the source of that knowledge and who has produced that knowledge might be useful itself, but I don't think it is a killer for the fact that that knowledge comes from a Canadian paper or something like that. Finally, in the COVID emergency situation that we are dealing with, which is obviously a question in which there's a crisis, some obviously which were foreseeable, many of which were not. I mean, some are foreseeable, part of which was not foreseeable, especially the disease part. One of the things that institutions such as the IEA could do is to be a knowledge broker. And a knowledge brokerage is also part of the reason, one thing that also think tanks do. So it's a form of research as well, in the sense that we synthesize papers and things that have been found out. So for instance, what are the facts about some of the vaccines, the costing, and everything else, and you place that in the public domain so that they are also useful in themselves for the media, who do the public work of informing a broader public than we do, but also it helps to inform the quality of debate. So elevating the quality of debates is one of the things we aim for, even if we do not influence policy. But part of our communication is to elevate the quality of debate so that people stop saying things that are completely wrong, but very strongly believed, that vaccines cause people to have a chip implanted in your body, and therefore somebody living in the US or somewhere else can track your movements, track your metabolism and other factors of it. So some of that might be, we are not medical researchers ourselves, but the best medical papers that are available out there allow us to be brokerage, in the sense that we can actually ask people, if you want to see what the latest information around medical science on the effectiveness of certain vaccines, here it is. All this definitely depends on how you pitch the 4 Rs. You must have that research, and that research could be primary research, it could be secondary research. You need the right relationships, whether in the media or people who make the decisions. A reputation matters, and obviously relevance. So I'm very thankful for this, and I hope that my few qualifications help you to understand how the IEA does this, but also confirms broadly the paradigm that was provided to us. Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Kwame. That was very, very, I think, very provoking, very insightful, as usual. I like what you said about, the issue around the authenticity of voice, and, linking into the validity of data, that yes, authenticity is essential, but the source of the data does not, really compromise the data at hand. And also like the point where you talk about, just elevating that information, putting it in a place where it can be useful for the public, you know, what you're calling knowledge brokering, making that information available and basically trying to like you've used a very relevant analogy, you know, the issue of the vaccine and all these myths that have gone around, you know, the COVID-19 vaccines. But, you know, how do you basically, you know, put the right information in the right hands, you know, in the right place, so that you can be able to ensure that you're elevating that debate and making people more informed as institutions that are transforming, you know, that information into digestible bits of information that can be digested and well understood by the public. I think at this point I want to open up the discussion. I don't see any hands up, but I see a question from William Musili, who's asking, how do you think tanks advocate and lobby? Interesting one, Musili. I think it's a question that many of us have to grapple with on a day-to-day. But how do you think tanks advocate and lobby without appearing as activists? I want to possibly throw this question first to Kevin, and then Kwame can also chip in. How do think tanks advocate and lobby without appearing as activists?
Thank you, William, for the question. And this one just really tries to conceptualize the CSO operating space, where you find that someone is able to victimize themselves. Am I being pro-government or against government? So for instance, let me just give you an example before I come back to the question. So late last year, we convened a CSO devolution forum on the BBI proposals. So we had a report, and then we've been analyzing, just trying to harmonize the draft and then come up with recommendations. So in the forum, listening to our partner CSOs, the take that the forum took was to analyze the BBI proposals, the first, the second, and the third draft, vis-a-vis the constitution, and then be able to come up with a harmonized draft, a position paper with recommendations that are able to share to the citizens so that they can be able to make an informed decision, other than for the CSOs saying yes or no, dichotomy, like before. So in terms of this, it's really difficult, but when you have data, when you have credible data, when you have channels that you can really run back to and say, see, here's the proof, you're able to have evidence that can stand test of time, then that way you can maneuver the aspect of being labeled as an activist or anti-establishment.
Thank you, Kevin. Can we also hear from Kwame, please?
Yes. Well, let me start with this. I think the word activism has been used as a smear word when people with very strong opinions confront mostly governmental decision makers. And activists are of different kinds. Some of them use some in-your-face tactics, very aggressive tactics, not violent, but in-your-face tactics, basically to express their displeasure or to try to change government or public opinion about certain things. And all that is constitutional. I mean, outside violence. So really, there should be no apologies for being an activist, except it's a very difficult job. I mean, I've studied some of them and met some of them. It's a difficult job. So the idea, I don't think that activism is a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I think most societies such as Kenya have too few activists. That's no wonder we have the kind of thing. So I don't have a problem. Now, as the IDA, we were formed to perform the function of knowledge brokerage, and some knowledge brokers then provide information which allows citizens to use that. And activism can be anything that involves action intended to change public policy, which is very active, which was basically might involve writing letters to your members of parliament, meeting members of parliament. So some of it is lobbying activity and all that. So this activism thing is just basically people who wear costumes. You can animate it, wearing costumes and doing that kind of thing. And I think I respect that profession quite a lot. And in fact, I give credit to those who can do it and do it well, because I am not. But I never apologize if sometimes when you, in our country, when you express your views very strongly, people can say that that's activism and it's supposed to make you be shy. No, certainly, I wish I was more activist myself. I can tell you 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to talk to the members of a professional association of Kenya for accountants. And at that time, there was no belief. There was a belief that if you're talking about corruption and if you're talking about public debt, that it is only because you supported the opposition. Of course, it was nonsense. I mean, sorry, it wasn't true. It was a way of smearing people. I was invited to their meeting this year, and many of them actually came to me. And they were the activists themselves telling me, why aren't you in the streets? And I tell them, no, I sit behind a desk and I try to convince people like you to go to the streets if you do, obeying the laws, because you have rights that allow you to picket and meet your members of parliament. That is useful. I consider my work done. But I think that I defend the idea that people have a constitutional right to, even there could be activism in a place like this, telling people, look, you have run down the national treasure. This country is insolvent. We think we can come, whether it's to the street or call members of parliament or meet the president, whoever it is you want to meet, in peaceful legal mechanisms. That is activism, and it is a respectable profession. I think there's another supply of activism in Kenya, and that's part, it might be because we try to shame people for all those reasons, or give the same impression that was given that they're not authentic, that some people do it because they were paid. Let me tell you, I think that the risks that some of them face and the kind of pain and pressure they feel under those professions, very few people are able to do that thing just because they're paid. Many people actually do not even give them money. Most activists in Kenya do that because they feel that passionately. Why? If you lost your job 2 weeks back, then you feel you need to make sure that the presidents, the cabinet secretaries, and parliament and speakers know that you're in pain, because you provide them with an air-conditioned sedan, or you provide them with a limousine, they might not feel it because they don't walk the streets of Kenya. So if it takes activism to make that legitimate question felt, I'd be proud to be associated with such people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. I could have thought you're an activist. Very passionate response. I think I see Phoebe, Dr. Phoebe, Josiah, I see your hand up, and I'll get to you. I just want to address one question in the chat, and then I will give you the opportunity to come on to the mic and articulate your question. I have a question here from Fidialis, who's asking, what are some of the innovative ways of disseminating research and engaging the public and stakeholders at large during the COVID-19 times? I'll throw that question to Dr. Njogu. I've been considering also that we had said that you. Yeah, Dr. Njogu, you're there? Okay.
Hello.
If you found the mic, just jump in. What are some of the innovative ways of disseminating research findings and engaging the public and stakeholders at large during these COVID-19 times, as we talk about communicating and advocacy?
All right, thank you very much for the question. I think we have to have the audience in mind as we try to figure out what is the best way to disseminate. So again, if you're targeting say policymakers, what are they listening to? I mean, so some may read our scientific journal, some won't. Do we need to then have briefs, that are actually suited to the specific policymaker and so on and so forth? Just regular meetings, or you actually present this kind of work, including whether those meetings are virtual or not. I think we have seen the use of webinars being used to actually disseminate this, especially to communities of professional communities and so on. So that's another method that we can use to do this. But I think when it comes to the general public, I like the term that was used, knowledge brokerage, just using the media, both traditional and social, depending on the target audience, so how are we able to use our, TV, our print media to just actually disseminate this information? Can we put it in terms of, in the form of an infographic? Can we do op-eds, to address some of these specific, to specifically target some of the things that we want to communicate? So I think it has to be broad. It has to be, targeted to as many. It has to be dependent on who we are targeting or what the communication is about. Yeah, and if possible, use multiple channels, because then people, many people don't watch TV. I don't remember the last time I actually watched TV, but you need to reach me. So what methods are those? I think it will depend on exactly what you're communicating and the specific target audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Njogu. That's really given us insight, because we know that COVID-19 disrupted how we communicate and engage with the public. And I think many of us grappled in terms of how we get this information out. And it's good to keep just being aware as think tanks, as researchers, how we can continue to disseminate this information. I want to call Phoebe Josiah to take the mic and possibly just briefly articulate her question. Yes, Dr. Phoebe. Dr. Phoebe, are you here with us? Yes, I can see you coming on. Please shoot your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this, Dr. Njogu. I like the ORs are put into. Njogu, as a professional in
Is it just me, or is Dr. Josiah? Dr. Josiah, I think you froze for a moment. Okay.
Hear me for a moment.
Yeah, we lost you for a bit. You froze.
Yes, I just wondered. Start one of the key departments. Strong bonding between the think tanks.
I'm not sure whether it's
get fatigued. You know, some can you hear me still or not yet?
You are freezing. I don't know if that's just from my end. Could someone let me know whether you've had Dr. Josiah?
Up to
no, not really. She's quite a bit.
Yeah, Dr. Josiah, perhaps you could place your question on the chat. We are having difficulty following your question. You're coming in and you're freezing. We're losing you at some point. Perhaps we'll invite you to share the question on the chat, please. Yeah, I think we'll have her share the question on the chat as she works on her.
Trying to say,
Dr. Josiah,
there's a challenge. Yes.
Please share the question on the chat. I think we've missed most of it. We've missed most of her question. Maybe Joshua, if you can advise her to share the question on the chat. I don't think she's able to hear us. While we possibly address one of the other questions, I don't see any other hand up. We can address another. There's several chats which have come in. Someone advises her to channel the question on the message in message format. Dr. Moi is asking, many people often confuse policy advocacy and lobbying. Are the two, similar? Are the two concepts the same, or are they different? I will ask Dr. Njogu, could you please respond to this? And then there's another question as Dr. Njogu prepares her response. I can see a question here by Carolina Gemma, who's asking, how can we move away from dissemination events to promoting uptake and utilization of research evidence? How can we move away from dissemination events to promoting uptake and utilization of research evidence? Kwame, I'll ask you to come in to respond to that while Dr. Njogu is answering the question on policy, on the difference between policy advocacy and lobbying.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe I just want to put it out there that lobbying is a part of advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So, advocacy is broad. It can include educating. It can include, communicating in a way that probably the general public, decision makers, and other people are able to see your point. Whereas lobbying is very specific. You're actually targeting a very particular endpoint. Maybe it's a legislation that you're trying to change or a policy that you're trying to change. So it is just a component of advocacy. Advocacy is broad. You're using it to change not just the one particular thing, but even just how society sees, something. So it will include even, speaking in the media, speaking to the general public, speaking to decision makers and other players in the space. I hope that helps. But otherwise, lobbying is with a very particular end goal in mind. I don't know if that helps.
Sheila, you're muted.
The number of times I hear that remark in a day. Sorry about that. I was just appreciating the response from Dr. Njogu and ushering in Kwame to be able to give us a response on how we can move away from dissemination events to promoting uptake and utilization of research evidence. I think for many of us, sometimes it's very easy to have generate that data and knowledge. But then beyond the dissemination events, we seem to struggle in terms of actually translating or channeling that to positive policy reforms. So Kwame, how can we be better at promoting the uptake and utilization of this evidence that we're generating? Hey, you're also muted.
Okay, let me start with the fact that part of the reason we see that pattern where most CSOs or even some think tanks actually finish off with a report at a dissemination event and go no further than that is because most of the work that they do is project focused. So you have a work plan that says that you culminate, everything starts with the research, you go down there meeting people, doing the evidence, and then it culminates with a launch project and a couple of disseminations, and then you go to the next thing. So that's part of it. Now, to the extent that whether it's a funding cycle or the model that most think tanks and advocacy organizations have built looks like that, that's difficult to change. However, part of the way to change it is increasingly think tanks and CSOs are building strategic plans that take on a programmatic as opposed to a project approach. So if you take on a programmatic and not a project approach, so for instance, the IEA, one of our biggest project by far, program by far, we call it a program, which has the highest number of people, is basically our budget program. And so we track the entire budget process throughout the cycle, the year. The way most of these things happen is most CSOs are most active during the budget formulation and presentation stage. But obviously for us, we also want the decisions in terms of approval by Parliament, and we track it all the way back to the audit stage and then tie that cycle. So if you identify some cycle that's also related to the policy cycle, and it's easier to do that with the budget because the budget cycle is very regular. So part of that is basically we have to be more creative about how to make sure that these are programmatic events. So you also inculcate a staff bench that has the ability, understands various facets of the budget cycle, or understands, say, various facets of, say, if it's energy. So we have this every month, new prices coming in, and I think it's one thing that Kenyans are getting to be. So if those regular cycles exist, then it's an easier way to actually plan your activities around those regular cycles, because then there's opportunity at every moment to actually create the public education, which is essential, and obviously if an opportunity arises to change policy, because sometimes our role is not necessarily to change policy. That's very, very difficult, and it's not one, but you can actually create sustainable information brokerage throughout the cycle of a policy area, obviously, and see its connections to others. So I'm sorry, I don't give you a silver bullet. It involves a little bit of thinking, but also trying to go through those regular cycles. Or you can create a cycle of your own. I think there are also CSOs in Kenya who do work on education, where they also have a national education conference every year in which they, after the exams, they examine everything from the budget that was provided to anything that happened in terms of teacher deployments, resources, and then the audits. And then again, they started with the exams and try to connect that. So obviously some kind of business model approaches are also useful for dealing with that disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwame. That was very insightful. Just and a very good demonstration, using the budget cycle in terms of how you can promote uptake and utilization of evidence. I think just going back to Dr. Frida Njogu's presentation, in regard to relevance, she had actually she had discussed, that critical point of, and asked us the question of, do the time frames, reflect the policy cycle? So I don't know whether Dr. Njogu, you also want to jump in with your input in regard to this question. How do we move away from, basic dissemination events to actually utilizing and making good use of this data and promoting uptake? Going back to your point on relevance.
So I think beyond what Kwame has said, I think as I mentioned, just probably also seeing what is trying to understand what is keeping the evidence from being used. Sometimes it could be one, I mean, as you mentioned, maybe it's provided at the wrong time, it's off cycle, but also what are the other challenges within the institution that we are lobbying with in terms of using evidence. And I think one of the things that would be useful would be, for instance, if there are working groups around these things, just embedding ourselves there, trying to see how we can support. Is it that probably also knowing then what that being embedded in that position helps us also understand what are the challenges regarding using specific evidence that's there, what other needs in terms of capacity are required to be able to use the evidence, either maybe even understand it further, break it down further to be able to target specific interventions using that evidence. So I think largely, just being present in that space, but also just a continued engagement, so that it's not just a one-off, we're disseminating and we are done, but engagement, knowing what are the capacity gaps, can I help? If, for instance, we are showing evidence around I don't know, teenage pregnancies, how we are able to actually track that information beyond just the specific piece of evidence I have provided, but in a broader ecosystem of, are we able to get this information regularly available? If it's something that is easily collected, can we actually contribute towards the capacity of the organization then to be routinely getting this kind of information, but also routinely using it? So training if need. When you're in these spaces, then you're able actually then to engage on and see what areas our expertise can contribute towards. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does, Dr. Njogu. Thank you for amplifying that point. There is a question here. Well, it's more or less a comment that print media has been greatly discouraged as part of the containment measures during the COVID-19. I don't know who's posted that, but I think the print media really worked hard last year to demystify that and just to continue racking up the sales. Despite the fact that we had been discouraged from handling paper, and I still think they continue to be a force to reckon in terms of providing information. And I know many of us have turned back to the print media, publication of opinion pieces and so on, to just amplify and communicate and continue to advocate at this time. Kevin, I want to invite you as we prepare to wrap up. And we've done an hour, but I'm also cognizant of the time, given that I understand that a number of people are taking this away from their homes, and we want to be able to have one last session and the closing session before we close. So I will invite Kevin to just articulate a point he had made in the chat about how CSOs can be able to share information even with some of their downstream partnerships and other champions. To be able to convey the information. I think there's a question around, just getting that information also to citizens on the ground. Maybe I will invite him to articulate that as I invite the main speaker, Dr. Njogu and Kwame, and also yourself, Kevin. So possibly as you handle this question, I will also ask you to make your closing final remarks, and then we will go to Kwame to also make his closing remarks, and then Dr. Njogu. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, and sorry for the technical glitch I just had. So to articulate the issue, we note that whenever we come up with the knowledge products after our research, we tend to focus on the policy, and we forget to report back to our stakeholders, particularly the citizens. So it's good for them to be put in the loop so that communication is done in a two-track way. So one way of doing that, particularly during the COVID measures, we're not able to meet them physically. So the issue is just to identify those community-based organizations at the grassroots level. They were able to share information with them, or even have champions that we can facilitate with airtime, so we can share links to these products on WhatsApp, and they're able to digest them and share by SMS to their colleagues within those forums. So that's the best way we can sustain that conversation, so that as we pursue the policy, we owe it to them to give them feedback, so that they're able to continue engaging also at the downstream level. So on the other aspect of where it's supposed to wind out, I feel like as a CSO or generally the non-state actors, the onus is on us to ensure that we engage in consortium so we can have research. And then one thing what COVID has done to us, it has just exposed the issues. And the citizens know the issue now. Now the challenge is to us to build their capacity so that they can be able to articulate these issues. And for the CSOs, just to continue identifying the issues, track them, and see that maybe our policy suggestions are bearing fruits. And one way of doing that is just to work in consortiums, be able to capitalize on each organization's comparative advantage. And this will just take our initiative forward. Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you very much, Kevin, for the closing remarks and earlier response. I want to also invite Kwame to make his closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sheila. So I'll just make 2 points. The first one is that it has been noticed that that countries that have higher forms of political and economic development also have very capable think tanks, both in terms of generating information, putting that information in the public domain, and working with people who make decisions. So that's an important one, regardless of the color of their political persuasion. So some think tanks actually are politically driven, but the most important thing is that. So having identified that, I think also that the Kenyan Constitution, part of the IEAs is that the Kenyan Constitution allows us to work as a think tank, partly by generating knowledge and some kind of freedom of association and freedom of speech. It's for that reason, as we exercise those, that it's important for us to make sure that we bring credibility to public policy debates by generating information that others can use, but also information that is verifiable so that government can identify the policy alternatives. So if we continue to do that and using the paradigm that was given to us, research, you build relationships, you build reputations, you build relevance. Strong think tanks will make for a strong economy and also democratic culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwame. Strong think tank, strong economy. Thank you very much. A good way to end your input. I see Dr. Frida is ready also with her closing remark. Dr. Frida, please take the mic.
So thank you very much. For me, just one or two things to just to say at the end. Two things. One, thinking for us to think externally, what we need to do, just to continue having the impact that we have, having our evidence being used. So externally, I talked about building relationships, but also now participating in the ecosystem to ensure there is the capacity to use data to continue, contributing towards increased capacity with government, with everybody in the sector. Whereby we can use our expertise beyond even just specific outputs, use our expertise to contribute towards growth in this particular area. So that we have, a data use, culture. But two, internally, and by internally, I mean among, ourselves, think tanks, research organizations, and so on and so forth, is to amplify each other's work so that we're not always in competition, but we're actually able to amplify each other's work because we are a community. We are all hopefully working with the same goal to actually have, a better, country. So let's amplify each other's work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Njogu. Thank you very much, Kwame. Thank you very much, Kevin, for your very, very insightful discussions and input around this critical session on how we communicate, lobby, and advocate better during this time. As we have well understood, of course, COVID-19 has been disruptive to the whole population, but also to us as think tanks. How are we generating data? How are we disseminating and promoting the uptake of this evidence and knowledge that we are generating? I think from all the from this discussion from the three individuals, I think I leave this session with a lot of insight in terms of how we as think tanks can continue to reinvent ourselves. How are we designing our research and developing our policy agenda? How are we engaging and influencing the relevant actors? And how are we just also, knocking on those windows of opportunity to be able to continue to lobby and advocate for policy influence, because this is the most critical time as we seek to rebuild this country towards a path of socioeconomic development and put it on a firm footing. We as think tanks are really, really critical in terms of giving solutions to various challenges that have been occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to continue to be creative, we need to continue to be innovative, we need to continue to producing and generating that data, but most of all, we need to continue to communicate and lobby and advocate for the uptake of the requisite reforms that are required for us to build back better. Thank you very much to all the three of them, and thank you to Kipra for giving us that opportunity, to be able to have this session. I now end there and hand back to Joshua to take us back to the main program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for running that session successfully and in good time. I appreciate all the participants and the main presenter, Dr. Njogu, and Kevin and Kwame. Those are the issues that are running around, especially during this time of COVID, asking questions on how we can actually be able to communicate information very efficiently and they be able to be picked by the policymakers. Now, we want to enter into our last session, that is to deal with our last part of this symposium. And we will be looking at how we can be able to reform public policy and legislations so that they can be able to respond to emergencies such as COVID-19. And to take us through this session, we will have Dr. Njogu-Ndongwe moderating, but there are other participants, and therefore we need to save time. We have one presenter, and the presenter will have around 15 minutes, and then the other three discussants, each one of them have 5 minutes to react to the presentation, and therefore we will be able to close. As we do this, our rapporteurs are wrapping up the highlights of the day, what we will be able to carry and what we can be able to highlight for today. But then at the end of this symposium, we'll be able to package together a communique that will be able to be shared. So Elion, please take over so that you can be able to run us through the next session. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Joshua, for doing a nice job moderating us for today. And this is the last session, so those who are tired now, I think is good news, and is the shortest session of the day. I have a team of 3 experts. I have Rachel Osendo from Kenya Law Reform Commission. I have Dr. Mumo Nzau from Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I also have Mr. Nyabira Ben from Katiba Institute. And then I have 2 rapporteurs who are taking notes for us. We have done some reorganization in this session because we expected representation from the legislature, from the parliamentary caucus on evidence-informed oversight and decision-making, but they couldn't make it for today. But we kindly requested Rachel if she could maybe extend her remarks so that she uses the 10 or 15 minutes. And we are sorry, Rachel, for ambushing you at the last minute. And but we appreciate your kindness to be able to make a presentation. So I will allow the team to introduce themselves, tell us something small what they're doing about reforming public policy and legislation, and then we'll get into the real discussion. So this first round, don't get into the discussion, just tell us who you are and what you do, where you come from, and how it relates to the topic at hand. And then I think the second round, then we'll get into the crux of the sub theme. So I begin with Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Moi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you. So my name is Rachel Osendo. I work with the Kenya Law Reform Commission. I am a legislative drafter. I also engage in policy issues at the commission. The commission is actually mandated to keep under review all the legislation in the country, and we provide this technical assistance to both levels of government, that is both national and county government. And so we definitely check whether the legislation is constitutional, whether the legislation is fit for purpose, whether it is just, whether it is modern, whether it's also implementable. And we provide assistance to, again, both levels of government to formulate bills and to formulate policies, as well as regulations and administrative arrangements. We also undertake research, and we also undertake public education on law reform. And so in regards to the symposium we're having today, KLRC is quite well placed because of the aspects of any public education on law reform when it comes to any legislation or any policy reform that came in regarding COVID, or any preparation of legislation, or even just checking or auditing the implementability of legislation. So that is basically what we do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, for that brief bio. Dr. Mumo Nzau, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moi. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Horn Institute, we have been based, we are based in Nairobi, and we're now about 4 years going 5 old, and we've been basically involved in policy research, policy-oriented research, dealing with matters of conflict analysis, conflict management, and strategic research on matters of security, especially issues to do with prevention of violent extremism and terrorism. Dealing with, we have various programs on that, for example, the building resilience against violent extremism that is called BRAVE, among others, and as well as matters of governance and strategic communication. And I am one of the fellows there involved in matters of governance and statecraft. And it's a really a great pleasure to be together with colleagues from all over the world, think tanks from all over the world that KIPRA has brought together for this session, and therefore it has been a difficult period, but again it's a period for think tanks to rise up to the occasion. And Horn Institute has been involved in matters of dealing with policy matters in the context of this pandemic. We've been carrying out surveys. We started off with surveys almost immediately. The political impact, socio-political, social impact, economic, and so on, giving feedback to various policy facets in the country, in the region, and beyond, and so on. We have done some roundtable sessions around just within the COVID rubric of space, and some of them, out in say in hotels or in our premises, and so on and so forth. At the same time, strategic communication through various outlets that we have been using because of the COVID context. And therefore, I trust that this discussion is going to add a lot of value, given that when something like COVID happens, it was really unprecedented, and there are a lot of policy and legal implications around the conduct of things in all spheres. And then think tanks then have to rise up to this. Then finally, let me say also Horn Institute, we've been involved in training. We train across board, depending on where our services are needed, of course, the client base, locally, regionally, we work with AU, IGAD, we work closely with KIPRA, for example, we work with other organizations across board, and therefore most thankful that we have this opportunity to be with colleagues and friends across board on this one. So, Chair, going forward, of course, you will guide us on the next one.
Okay, thank you, Dr. I now invite Mr. Ben Nyabera from Katiba Institute. Ben, just take 2-3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moi, and I appreciate this opportunity for inviting us to participate in this symposium. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Nyabera Ben. I'm with the Katiba Institute. Katiba Institute is a research and policy and litigation institution based in Nairobi. We do quite a number of activities that are intended to influence policy. The activities include influencing policy through our research. We also influence policy through public engagement and through litigation. For example, through litigation, we influence policy or other legislation through our submissions in court. As we know, the judgments that come out of courts become law. And so when we contribute to certain aspects of the submissions that are relied on by the judges, it ends up contributing to the laws that are made through the courts, or rather through the jurisprudence. Through public engagement, by engaging members of the public to ensure that public institutions are accountable to what they do, that the fact that members of the public are more aware of certain aspects of public policy, it's likely that they are likely to influence how the state, or rather which policies states adopt towards certain issues. The same thing to research. Our research informs what we do. We sometimes contribute directly to legislations in Parliament. And we also make, for example, access to information requests, which are intended to influence state action on certain issues. So thank you very much, and we are very pleased and happy to participate in this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Now that is my strong team that will take us through this topic. And the reason why we are concerned about public policy and law is because public policy and law constitute the heart, the soul, and the identity of any government. And that it's only public policy and law that starts protecting us immediately we are conceived and takes us through until we are buried. So for now, I think we will have a short presentation from Rachel. So Rachel, you have 15 minutes to do your presentation. We don't expect you to have a PowerPoint because of the short notice. So just make your presentation the way you have prepared yourself. And then I'll invite the discussants to give feedback to your presentation. And then that will usher us into the plenary. So karibu, Rachel.
So thank you again, Dr. Moi. So I just jotted down a few notes because as you stated, I wasn't planning to have a PowerPoint presentation. But I think what I'm going to do basically in my presentation is just going to be guided by just looking at overall why we develop legislation. And then I'm going to give you the data that we have had in terms of legislative initiatives during this COVID period. Then we're going to look at the wins in terms of the legislative initiatives. What were the wins? Then we're going to look at a few of the challenges that came out. And then I think we're going to look at lessons learned so that then we can then move on to plenary and see how we forge forward from that. So I think generally we would all agree then that legislation is developed to maintain order. Legislation is developed to protect rights and liberties. And we also develop legislation when we want to raise revenue in form of taxes, or basically when we want to ensure enforcement. These are the reasons why we actually develop legislation. And so COVID-19 put us in a place that was unknown. And so there was the aspect of do we cushion ourselves? How do we look at this economically? How do we sort out ourselves socially? What are the political implications? What are the technology issues that are coming up? And so there were definitely a few legislative initiatives in terms of this. So in terms of the numbers, we had about 10 executive orders from the president. We had 12 legal notices, and we also had regulations that were, for example, the one that established the COVID-19 fund. And this is just from the executive arm of government. When you go to the judiciary, we had practice directions that were delivered by the Chief Justice. We had practice directions that were delivered by the presidents of the respective courts. We had at the Court of Appeal, we had at the High Court as well. And these particular practice directions were looking at issues like e-filing, issues like case management, or even administrative issues in terms of accessing the courts. And for Parliament as well, they had guidelines. And these guidelines basically were internal guidelines, just looking at how they would govern themselves as the staff and also as the members of Parliament. Again, at the judiciary, tribunals were also issuing direction in terms of how any clients or the members of public could be able to actually access the tribunals. So when we look at the general wins, so that's the basic data. We also had a few MDAs that issued certain directives. Ministry of Foreign Affairs was issuing a direction in terms of travel into and out of the country. EACC was issuing direction in terms of filing any returns. And we had Ministry of Labor again issuing something on social assistance. And so our outlook on this was that it was very heavy on subsidiary legislation. When you look at the Statutory Instruments Act, it defines what constitutes a statutory instrument. You have executive orders, you have direction, you have rules, you have regulations, and you have guidelines. And so all of these, in our view as Kenya Law Reform Commission, really constituted statutory instruments, which is basically subsidiary legislation. So what we saw during the COVID-19 period, first and foremost, was that I would say all the legislative initiatives in terms of response to COVID were subsidiary legislation. And so what that means then is that our substantive legislation was very enabling in terms of, because the substantive legislation gives the power for the development of the subsidiary legislation. And so the subsidiary legislation drew the authority from the substantive legislation. And it will be very surprising to find acts like the Public Health Act, which I think was enacted in 1932 or 1921, I think, 1921. The Public Order Act was enacted in 1950. But these legislations, as they stand today, were still able to lead us into the development of subsidiary legislation that we've been using to actually govern ourselves during this COVID period. But then again, it has also presented an opportunity, and KLRC, for example, is working with the Ministry of Health to now reform the Public Health Act, so that the Public Health Act can actually now meet the needs when it comes to emergencies, becomes to unknowns like we found ourselves in. And so we are already embarking on an initiative to actually reform the Public Health Act. I think the other issue in terms of the wins, and I think this one was really, really central, was that the legislation that came out during the COVID period was multi-sectoral. And when I say multi-sectoral, I'm just going to point out the different sectors where we saw the different legislative initiatives. And then after that, we will then go quickly into the challenges. So when we look at employment, we look at the executive orders from the president. We also had direction and policy from even the head of public service. And there were aspects about working from home. There were aspects about those who were 58 and over were already classified as marginalized. And so how to manage them in terms of them not necessarily going to the office. And you can see that this is already tying in with the Public Service Commission's mandate of trying to find innovative ways in which we can actually work, not necessarily going physically to the office, but trying to see if there are any other innovative ways in which where we are, we can still be productive and we can still be contributing as a workforce. The other aspect, I think, was access to justice. I just mentioned earlier, there were quite a number of practice directions from the judiciary. We saw the rise in e-filing. We saw the rise in electronic case management. We also saw joint statements from the National Council on Administrative Justice, which talks about how incarcerated persons would be able to access the court sessions, or those who are already suspects, how they will be able to access the court sessions. And so these practice directions, we can say, were initiated to actually ensure that there was access to justice. There was also a legal notice by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, where they were waiving the fees, court filing fees for cases that in the commercial division that were valued at a million Kenya shillings and below. Again, because of the impacts of COVID-19 and of course sudden impacts when it comes to economic issues, we could already see the Cabinet Secretary there taking cognizance of that, so that you don't impede any member of the public who would like to actually access the courts. I think the other thing that other area we can look at is the corporate governance. And we have, I think, legal notice number 50, if I'm not wrong, but that particular legal notice provided for how meetings would actually be held by companies, by boards of organizations, including public sector organizations. And it provided for having virtual meetings as well as having hybrid meetings. When the pandemic came up, and we didn't know how do we conduct ourselves, how do we do the meetings? We have to minimize physical distance. And so again, in terms of corporate governance, we had a legal notice that was actually telling us that you can actually do virtual or you can actually do hybrid meetings. In terms of public health, and I'd say for public health, there were quite a number. Actually, most of them were public health and public order. And we had legal notices for public health that were actually looking at ways of handling an area that is infected, or ways of handling a body of somebody who was passed on and was infected with COVID-19, how to manage the premises, how to access the premises, to even disinfect the premises, or to even cordon the premises. And we saw a lot of that from public health. We saw also in terms of cessation of movement, and these were all captured again in legal notices, and this was directed basically at public health. There was also the aspect of funerals and basically how to handle the bodies in the morgue and all that, yeah. Then we saw also the fiscal policies. We saw fiscal policies and we saw initiatives in terms of policy change from the central bank. We saw policy change from Safaricom. And you see the bank was also waiving certain transaction charges. Safaricom was also waiving certain transaction charges. And these policy reforms were then adopted as proper government directive. The head of state was seen expressing that is exactly what should happen, and that's exactly what happened. And so what we can say is that the public were able to, to transact some more. The public were able to hold some more money within the digital spaces and are able to engage in as well cashless transactions. The other issue we'll look at is taxation. And during this period, there were quite a number of changes to certain legislations. We saw a legal notice to the Income Tax Act, which was waiving payment of taxes for a certain bracket. And it also lowered the higher band from 30% to 25%. We also saw changes with the VAT, and we saw change from 16% to 14%. There was also a change in payment of corporate tax from 30% to 25%. And I think also during this period, there was also a policy direction that there will be temporary suspension of listing of defaulters in the Credit Reference Bureau. And so again, these were captured again in legal notices, and these were effected. Then we look at cessation of movement. I think that has been the major one, and definitely the one that has really been a buzz and a discussion amongst us as the Kenyan public. And the cessation of movement, again, was captured under the Public Order Act. We have a number of legal notices. We even have one currently in force that is actually restricting movement, and there was that legal notice that restricted inter-county movement. There was also the legal notice that restricted inter-country movement. We had our borders buffered, I think, between Kenya and Tanzania. And so again, you can see how legislation came into effect to actually ensure that some of these issues were then enforced. The other aspect we look at is social assistance. We recall then that there was a fund that was established under the PFM Act, which was the COVID-19 Fund Act. And this was an act that was basically established to purchase essential supplies, to cushion the vulnerable people, to cushion the vulnerable businesses, and I think also to assist relevant research institutions. And so again, that was another legislative initiative that was seen to create a fund, and that was initiative between government and private sector. The other issue I would speak about was social behavior, and we had legal notice number 50, regulated social behavior, and this is the legal notice that pointed out social distancing, it pointed out wearing of masks, it pointed out institutions having temperature checks at the entrance, and having sanitizer and hand washing stations. And this was captured in a legal notice. And today, if you go, I think you'd say that our institutions and our premises are doing very well when it comes to this. In terms of us as individuals, as humans, I think that will be a discussion for when we look at the challenges. And then there was the aspect of public gathering. A couple of the legal notices, even one in place right now, basically prohibited public gathering. And this prohibited public gathering in terms of funerals, in terms of weddings, in terms of political gatherings as well. And this was, of course, again, to limit the social distance. I think the last 2 points I'll talk about is digitization, the uptake in terms of technology. And I think this has been a discussion all through from morning, the uptake in terms of technology. And for example, Gazette Notice number 5998, which I had spoken about in terms of allowing boards to have hybrid and virtual meetings. In one of the executive orders, the president directs that cabinet would not hold any more physical meetings, there's a legal notice in place right now that is actually prohibiting holding of physical meetings. And so again, we see public gatherings are being managed, and there's the digitization, and we're being encouraged to actually meet virtually. Then I think the last aspect I'll pick on is really on businesses and how businesses have been impacted. And I think when you have restriction of goods and you have restriction of people, it definitely impacts business eventually. And we saw, and we have seen the legal notices that have restricted sale of food in premises and only stated that you can have takeaway, or closing the restaurants, closing the bars, or closing managing also the transport sector in terms of the PSVs. And how many people can actually be seated in a PSV. So we had that. We had those legislative initiatives as well, and we even have one that is in place currently. So I think when having looked at that, there are certain challenges definitely, and certain wins, of course, that came out of this. For access to justice, what I can say is that perhaps the access to justice was limited to persons who had access to internet connectivity. That is a possibility. I belong to a group of advocates where I think every morning at 8:30 to 9 o'clock, I think the hula baloo in the group is really, has anybody managed to access this court? Is this judge in session? Is this magistrate in session? Or, hey, so-and-so, your name has been called out as an advocate on record, but you're not here, can I hold your brief? We've had a lot of those challenges. We've had challenges where you are filing a matter maybe under certificate of urgency, and then you file it, but then, it doesn't get filed. You're not able to reach the officers. And so we've had that limit in terms of accessing justice. In terms of the fiscal policies and the waivers that we saw on the transaction fees, I think those were reversed in January, and I think we came back to the status quo. And so I think there's a lot of grappling amongst the public, or whether this should have gone on a bit longer, and whether this is something that should have been enforced for a longer period, or is it that we didn't plan ourselves well? So those are some of the challenges. Then I think the other issue is balancing basically our rights and what these legislative initiatives are actually enforcing. With cessation of movement, I think all of us, when you go to social media, the first thing you'll see is, people are feeling, claustrophobic, so to speak. But then again, are we attaining a good balance between my freedom of my right in terms of being able to move freely, and also having the cessation of movement in place? And then I think the other issue was that for the social assistance, in terms of the COVID-19 fund, I think when we assessed when we reviewed the regulations when they were in draft form, I think one of our challenges was the eligibility criteria of how to identify who are these vulnerable people. It was not very clear. And then I think we would also like to also note to have, maybe a report or an impact assessment on whether the particular fund also achieved its objectives. Then I think the other thing would be the social behavior that I mentioned. We have seen as human beings, probably the most difficult part is regulating human behavior. When you're asked to wear a mask, when you're asked not to gather in public, when you're asked to wash your hands, to sanitize, are we doing that? Because the law actually states that we should do that, and there's a penalty if you don't do that. So is it an issue of weak enforcement, or is it an issue of, do we have a culture issue such that we don't adhere to the laws of the land? That would actually be one of my comments. And I think for the public gatherings, especially the political gatherings, again, how do we balance then my freedom to associate and the political, the aspect of restricting us to be able to gather politically? I think those were some of the issues that came out, some of the feedback that we received when we were reviewing some of these documents. I think the other challenge then would also be the digitization aspect could have caught us off guard, especially in our public sector. Were we caught off guard? Should we now really prioritize when it comes to adaptation of technology? Because you can already see a lot of the legislative initiatives are already making a direction that actually states then that now we should actually engage in virtual meetings and, and so were we caught off guard? Can we be more prepared for this? Then I think the other aspect is for business and the challenges that businesses have faced. Are there new ways? Yes.
I'll be glad if you can wind.
Yes, I'm actually winding up in another 5 minutes. So whether there are new ways of doing business and whether we can embrace digitizing our businesses and how do we move then into that particular space. And I think the other aspect that was very central was whether there were enough consultations, considering the period that we were in and we were having limited physical interaction. Were there enough consultations with particular parties who would be affected by this particular legislations? And the other thing I think we noted was that government coordination may have been impeded and may have been affected during this particular period because we were thrown, straight from physical and into virtual. And so then does this have an impact on the quality of the legislations that were actually produced? But I'd just say overall, and I think I'm wrapping up right now, is that in terms of the lessons that we've learned, I think that it's important for us to always prepare legislation that is implementable and legislation that is fit for purpose. And so I think, Dr. Moi, one of our main take-homes here would just be 3 points, is that is it possible for us in the public policy space, as well as legislative, to be able to approach our issues through the problem-driven iterative approach, so that we have step-by-step ways in which we can identify our problems, step-by-step ways in which we can see what our root causes are. Because it doesn't mean, it's not always that a legislative solution is necessarily the answer. The second point would be that the president did not declare. Sorry about that. Let me just. Somebody should mute their mic. So the president didn't declare a state of emergency in accordance with Article 58 of the Constitution. And I think there was a bit of a misconception for policymakers at the onset of COVID as to what space we're in and whether we should develop legislation that would then freeze, to say that, okay, then tenants should not pay rent. Okay, we should not pay our water bills. We should not pay our electricity bills. I think there was a misconception there, and we were not in a state of emergency. If anything, our laws as they stood substantively were very adequate in terms of enabling us to actually prepare the necessary subsidiary legislation. And then I think I'll wrap up with my last point and say, collectively, it's important for us to carry out impact assessment. The post-legislative impact assessment would be really important for us to be able to see whether the legislation achieved what it was supposed to achieve, and where it didn't achieve, then what are the ways in which we can actually reform this particular legislation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. I think your presentation has been quite well presented. You've touched actually a lot of issues relating to policy reform and also reform of legislation. Yeah, I would like to move to Dr. Mumo Nzau, just to react to some of the issues that have been raised and maybe get us into new issues that maybe could have been left out. So, Karibu.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Moi. a very good discussion by Madam Osendo. She has elicited, and very important issues that are intellectually stimulating and really incisive in the context of policy and law. And when she was talking, then it led me to a number of issues that relate to the broader debate of governance. Because governance is not only local, but it is also regional and global. So when you talk about in the midst of a global pandemic here, then we then have to ask what are the global governance platforms. It takes you back to your public international law, and it takes you back to various international practices and standards. And countries then have to position themselves there. And of course, countries are not the same, states are not the same. Some are, of course, maybe authoritarian in character. Others are maybe, of course, various forms of liberal democracies. Like Kenya, we aspire to be a democracy. We are guided by the Constitution and so on. And now, relating all that to the context matters in question here in the context of COVID, then the question was, what is, and Madam Osendo alluded to it, this balance between order, and liberty. And then again, order and stability. An authoritarian system can enforce order. In fact, it can be more stable than a transitional democracy. But also a fully fledged consolidated democracy can also enforce order in many ways. But look in between. During COVID, the things that were happening in the United States, the ongoing case about the racist issue, the Floyd case, and in between, there are a number of things then that come into play. How much can you afford as a democracy? How far do you go to enforce the law? And how far do you go to protect the ethos of constitutionalism, given this context? And it really, COVID put governments in very difficult situations. You want to protect life, liberty and property, because if you lose a life, it is itself already a threat to human security. Yet, if you then lose another life in the process of protecting that very one, then it becomes again a dilemma and a problem. So then a few things then come to mind here. How then do you balance between order and liberty? And how do you ensure order as you enhance stability? And that then brings in questions that are broader in governance, what we call the empirical dimensions of governance. One is leadership. You need responsive and responsible leadership that is able to enable the electorate, its citizenry, to be able to support the law. Because this is what we call in the policy cycle support. So if you lack that support, then the laws will not work and the policies will not work. There is need for that participation, so public participation and support. But then there is citizen oversight and what we call social reciprocity. Now, oversight is very important, and participation. You saw, all the noise, for example, we had in Kenya about, for example, how some of the COVID funds were used and all this and such, all that, all these issues, and Kwame was alluding to some of these issues and so on, our last session. And these are very important issues that then, because if you then have a situation where laws and policies don't enjoy the legitimacy that should support them, then they don't work. It becomes counterproductive. So countries have, it's not Kenya alone, countries have had to grapple with those issues and so on, because governments were faced with the situation of you have first to protect life, but at the same time, you have to ensure that livelihoods, come through, and some degree of economic, wealth creation. And it reached a point we were staring at total lockdowns, and the question was now, it's basic subsistence. So, just basic survival over and above that. Now, the question then again was how, you can't live beyond your means. Countries don't have the same capabilities. They don't have the same wealth, capabilities. And we saw even in Europe and in North America and other places in the north, where even governments that have traditionally been known to be very able, really on their knees. What we saw in Lombardy, in northern Italy, in the US itself, and so on. And therefore, there was need for well-structured agenda setting for purposes of informing legislation. Now, like Dr. Osendo said, Kenya being a country that, Madam Osendo said, Kenya being a country that has come this far, we really have a number of structures in place. We didn't have to go up to the basics, but there was the question about, we have these pieces of legislation, we have statutes, but how do we then moderate these issues so that we live up to the times? And so the question was, then how do we come up with, and that was the use now of the executive orders, presidential, sort of decree kind of thing, orders, and some of them crafted well within well-consultative contexts, like the COVID committee, the National Security Council, National Security Advisory Council, and so on. And of course, President and Cabinet, and that kind of thing. And plus the ministries, departments, and agencies around the whole rubric. So for me, I see a lot of issues here that point to the idea of making a legislation, especially legislation that that is subsidiary. It has just come around because of especially circumstantial contexts, because problems are not just fundamental, they can be procedural and circumstantial. And that circumstantial context is what really I saw Madam Osendo attack and address here, because you have to aggregate, you have to set agendas, and so on, and not really, sort of overhauling the law overnight, but trying to position yourself so that things can move. And so we had all these orders and so on and so forth. So, process of enforcing the law is not always, because of human nature, is not always the same. But of course, you have to build a socio-political culture that would be able to enable the law to work each time. And these are problems that are across different, you'll be surprised, sometimes even in democracies where people enjoy a lot of freedom and sometimes they are bound to abuse it, they suffer more. Then in situations where governments have a little bit of more space, which is not ideally the best thing, but sort of in authoritarian systems, sometimes it works to help put some of these situations in control. So, Chair, I don't know if I have overshot my time, but I thought those are some of the issues that were important to add value to the discussion that we are discussing here. Decision making in crisis. How about that? How the public reacts, Kenyans on Twitter the next day to a certain executive order and so on and so forth. How quickly, as think tanks, for example, do we have to think through quickly so that if governments need to be advised on something, then we can come through with a prescription that will not only work in the medium term, but also be sustainable, because each time policies are not just the incremental nature of policies. You don't just start from scratch, but somehow you go in an incremental fashion, building on what has been there. So there's a lot that we have to learn, and then not lose that institutional memory. And then, of course, keep ensuring that these empirical dimensions of governance are important to be roped in. Leadership, citizens, and culture, a supporting socio-political culture, citizen oversight, and social responsibility is what makes laws, statutes, and all manner of legislative orders, legal notices work for a country. But it needs leadership in order for all that to be palatable among the people. So well, whether it was done so well or not, that can be debated, but countries have had to face all this. It's not just a Kenyan issue, and that this is a global audience. And the more we exchange our experiences as think tanks, the more we are able to meet our ideals, mostly as the countries that aspire to be consolidated democracies, but as well as good citizens of the world. So Chair, I would stop there. I hope I haven't overshot my time, sir.
Okay, thank you. I want now to move to the to Ben. So Ben, Karibu, try to maintain the 5 minutes, please, so that we don't finish too late.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Moi. Thanks, Rachel, for the very insightful presentation. I think listening to you, I would probably summarize your presentation as follows. That it is a good thing to know that despite having this kind of a pandemic for the first time, we didn't have to, significantly have a very new legislation. I know we did have, I think, an amendment to the Public Order Act, because at the very first time when a curfew was declared, I think it was done through subsidiary legislation, and at some point Parliament was called to legislate. I think on the Public Order Act, if I'm not wrong, and that probably was the only substantive or other legislation that was done on a substantive legislation. But even that, it wasn't a completely new legislation. So that is one point that I got from your presentation. The second point relates to examples of those pieces of legislation, including the executive subsidiary legislation, including the executive order, including the various regulations, the practice directions, the legal notices, and it's great that you are able to do research and have a very long list of the various pieces of legislation that have been put in place during this period. And then you also classify them in terms of the areas. For example, some of them focused on cessation of movement, others focused on regulating public gatherings, others on social behavior, regulating social behavior, including issues of sanitizers, wearing of masks and such like, others on businesses, including sometimes requiring that there should not be residential, for example, eateries and all that. So it only allows takeaways. Some of it related to access to justice in court, the use of court internet to file cases, and among others. So in summary, I think those are some of the things that you highlighted, and then you went ahead to discuss each one of the potential effects of these issues. And I would like to very briefly contribute to that aspect, and probably in about 4 areas. The first one is on the effects of these pieces of legislation and policies on how enforcement has been a problem or an issue. For example, when it comes to public order legislations, we know that in many cases, in some places, you can hear allegations that the curfew, for example, do not apply. And so there are some areas where the curfew issues tend to apply. In some others, that's not necessarily the case. And the question is, why is that the case? In another thing is about, there are also allegations that we have, for example, lockdowns in some places, and the allegations that it's possible that some people that are not required to cross the lockdown from one lockdown area to outside the lockdown areas, they do so if they can bribe the police. And the question is, why is that possible? And so I think that looks into the question of enforcement. And I think one of the issues that is contributing to such could be the fact that not every citizen has adequately recognized how the various measures that have been put in place contribute to protecting their health, in terms of contributing to helping them not contract the virus. And so it's more of, it is a government directive, and so this is something that is almost brought to us almost to punish us. And so because probably there has not been adequate convincing of the people so that they can buy the idea, enforcement becomes a problem of some of these issues. And so whenever such pieces of legislation are put in place, I think there needs to be a proper mechanism of ensuring that there is a buy-in of the people, which the previous speaker talked of public participation, so that people appreciate. But then the other aspect on enforcement is that the very first time some of these measures were in place, I think many people kind of bought the idea that it was in their interest to obey those restrictions. But then later, when allegations, for example, of corruption came about, people lost faith because others saw that it is the regulations are there for a few to take advantage of them and engage in corruption and benefit out of a pandemic. And so because of such issues, people lose faith in certain restrictions that are put in place, and so enforcement becomes a problem. So besides enforcement, partly some of my points up there talks about compliance, how you ensure that the people are able to comply. And one of the contention has been whether the issue of COVID-19 is a public health issue or is it a public order issue? So is it for the doctors to deal with, or is it primarily for the police to ensure that the problem is addressed? I think many people believe it should at least be packaged. The narrative should be that it's a public order issue. That hasn't been the case. I think mostly it's been the police that are at the forefront in ensuring enforcement and compliance. And so that somehow makes people resistant to the to orders or even to appeals that are put across by the government. And so there is an issue with compliance. So when some of these pieces of legislation are put across and they are done through, many of them through, for example, Ministry of Interior, it sends a message. And if the message is more of, it's an order that people must follow, there's likely to be resistance, which should be avoided. And lastly, my 2 points would be about the issue of the need to focus on transparency. If there is transparency in the way some of these things are done, including publicizing some of these legislations, it makes it easier for people to understand, and it makes it difficult for some police officers, for example, that may want to take advantage of ignorance of some members of the public to seek bribe. So if people know what, for example, on this issue of essential services, not everyone has that information on what amounts to essential services. And so some people that may, for example, be transporting fresh produce may not know that they are actually allowed to go past the lockdown areas. And so if they don't, the police will obviously then take advantage, can easily take advantage of that situation, the ignorance, which partly is because of lack of adequate publicization of those pieces of legislation to seek bribe. And so if members of the public understand well what the regulations are, then it's likely that those various pieces of legislation are more likely to be effective. I think I'll stop there. I've exceeded the 5 minutes, unless I'll be asked to speak. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for those observations. And I think now we are done with the presentation, which was quite comprehensive. We've got some views from Dr. Mumo and now from Ben. Because I know time is fast spent, what I'll do is I'll invite comments from the plenary, and then each person I'll assign questions for you to respond to those issues. So I want now to move to the plenary and get feedback on what has been presented, so that we can then wrap up this session. I know I already have some questions on the through the chat, but we can also get feedback through by raising hand. There's an icon for raising your hand. So I'll go straight into the ones which are on our chat, our chatting tool. And the first one is to Rachel. The question is, from a gender perspective, how can you influence the Employment Act to give lactating women opportunity to work from home for at least 9 months where practicable? So that is one. You can just note them so that you'll. Now then we have the second one on. The question is from Janet, and it says COVID-19 has provided opportunity for people to work from home. This proved effective, hence the need to have a policy change on maternity leave. So I don't know whether this one I'll also give it to Rachel, because it's to do with the maternity again. Then there is Carol. And this is again to Rachel. To what extent did the Kenya Law Reform Commission champion for policies targeting women in the informal sectors who fall outside the tax brackets? And then this one, I think I want to give it, it is from Fidelis. I want to give it to Ben from Katiba Institute. Are there additional legal reforms in the pipeline to cushion Kenyans economically during the third wave? Ben, that is for you. I have another one here from Nelson. And this one will be for Dr. Mumo. It says human behavior influences much on effective actualization of public policy. There is need to strengthen systems for monitoring and evaluation, especially on how public policies are enforced and complied with. So, Dr. I think you can handle that one. And I'm not seeing any hands. I've seen another one has come. I can't see the name, but it says the containment measures affected women and men differently, impacting on the lives of women and girls. GBV issues were on the rise. How do we ensure legal aid is instituted to support and cushion women and girls? This one I can direct it to Dr. Mumo also. So I've not seen other questions. So maybe I'll start with Rachel. You can respond to the queries that have been raised, and then we'll move to Dr. Mumo.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Moi. So just looking at Janet's question is how can we influence the Employment Act more so to give lactating women an opportunity to work from home for at least 9 months where practicable. So Janet, we, as a Kenya Law Reform Commission, we actually engage both state and non-state actors. We're a state agency, but we engage both state and non-state actors and assist them to be able to contribute, of course, to government policy through the formulation of legislation, formulation of bills. And so one way that we can actually engage is that later after this, we can actually exchange contacts and you can give us what views or what exactly you would like to see to be included as a change in terms of influencing the Employment Act. I say this because we are currently working with the Ministry of Labor, which is developing a bill to actually amend the Employment Act. And so I think this would also be an opportune time for you to be able to just send us in a brief of what you'd like to see. And we can engage on this, and then we can see how we can then transmit it in our engagement together with the Ministry of Labor. I can take the second question. The second question again is on the policy change again on maternity leave. Again, I think I have answered that with my previous issue in terms of how we can engage. Carolina Gemma was asking to what extent did KLRC champion for policies targeting women in the informal sector who fall outside the tax brackets. Caroline, what I can say is that in terms of matters that come to tax issues, because your question is not very clear, for the women who fall outside the tax brackets, what exactly would you want to be championed for them, if I may ask? What kind of policies? Yes.
I meant women who are working within the informal sector. So there are these, stimulus packages that were rolled out, but was there some deliberate effort made to cushion these informal traders or informal workers?
All right.
That's clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's quite clear now. I think I had mentioned that there was the COVID-19 fund that was actually established under the PFM Act. And the objectives of the fund was to cushion the vulnerable in society. Again, there was the aspect of cushioning the vulnerable businesses And these were MSMEs and businesses that were also owned by women. And so there was a criteria that was actually targeting the vulnerable people in that particular regulation. What I can say we did as KLRC, and actually this was loaded on the floor of the House, is that when we gave our comments on that particular regulation before it was approved by Parliament, is that for us it was not clear who the vulnerable person was. The definition of the vulnerable person in that particular legislation was not very clear. The approach in terms of how the social assistance was supposed to be done and to identify the businesses as well as the people, again, was also not quite clear. And those are the comments that we sent forward, and those are the comments that were actually discussed on the floor of the House. I hope I've answered your question on that. And I think the third one would then be, did I have another question? Or that was it? I think that was it.
Yeah, I think that was it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Dr.
Thank you, Chair. I couldn't agree more with, I trust that was Nelson, if I got the name right, and they are talking about effective actualization of policy, and I think this is a very important one. And one of the things that makes policy to be effective is if the people who make those policies and those who implement them, especially policy implementation, is always at best followed by or buttressed with monitoring and evaluation component. Now, in the policy cycle, this is what we call feedback. That feedback, because governments world over are, so long as they are democratic governments, they have a bigger audience to please, because so that they can remain in power next time they're elected, and that's the cycle. And therefore, they respond to all manner of claims from citizens, what we call demands. And these demands, therefore, are then digested by governmental authorities. And in these processes, whether in the context of short-term or crisis context, like we've been, where a lot of subsidiary legislation has to be made, then there is need, therefore, to follow it up and to get info. So one thing that is very important is how it is communicated, how it is followed up, and the degree of sensitivity that a government has to how a policy uptake is the flow of policy. Is it the ebb and flow of it, so that governments then are sensitive to that, and then they are quick not to react but to anticipate in good time and to take the relevant policy actions in order to make those policies to follow through. So I think the responder had, the Nelson had a very good point on that, and it's a very important aspect, what we call feedback in the policy process. And I think in the interest of time, then I would stop there, Chair, so that probably the next discussant can respond to the other question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ben, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Moi. So I think Rachel has responded partly to the question that Fidelis had asked, which was whether I'm aware of any additional legal reforms to caution Kenyans economically during this so-called third wave. So Rachel has said that in the other phases or waves of COVID, there was COVID fund. I'm not aware if there is any piece of legislation that is creating any fund for this period. I'm also not aware if the fund that had been created is still on. What I know is, as Katiba Institute, we did undertake humanitarian aid in some informal settlements in Nairobi, and at that time, I never met one person who said that they had benefited from government aid. I'm not sure if it's the usual public or everybody saying they've not come across government, but that was the case. No one ever said that they had benefited from the COVID fund related issues. But then what I know is, but relating to the other measures, for example, reduction in taxation, we know that those ones haven't been done and it hasn't been mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in the presidential address of 2 weeks ago, nor by any other authority. So it seems like that may not be the case this time. Thank you.
Okay. So mine is to thank the presenter, Rachel, and the two discussants, that is Momo and Ben, and also the plenary for your feedback. I think this has also been a very interactive session. I know we have picked some snippets from this session that would lengthen our discourse as we leave this platform. So I think thank you so much for your time and your presentations that you have made. So I think I want to close this session now because I know we under pressure to conclude for the day. So I want now to hand over this session back to the overall moderator so that he can guide us on the next steps. So thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Eliud, Rachel, and your team, and Dr. Mumo and Ben, for that very good summary of that session. I can see we have been here for more than 9 hours for those who have been here, and really we appreciate. And without wasting time, I want the Chief Rapporteur, Babade Musili, to prepare to put for us, because the team has been summarizing issues related to this symposium, and we want to see what is it that is coming out for now. As I mentioned again, we shall be able to have a summary of issues later, a comprehensive one with a communique. And what we want to look at now is what is it that is coming out. So I don't know whether verbally you are able to hear me.
Yes, Joshua, I can hear you.
Yes, please go ahead so that we can be able to finish. Tell us what is it that is coming out so that we can be able now to have a take home for all of us. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua. As he has said, my name is Beverly Musili. I'm a policy analyst in the Partnerships Department of KIPRA. I will take you through the key highlights of today's symposium. I will take you through according to the various sub-themes that have been presented. As he mentioned, there'll be a more comprehensive report of the proceedings. So mine will just be the brief highlights. So I will start by taking you through the session on conducting adaptive policy research in times of crisis. So that commenced with a quote by one of the presenters, that's Mr. Kariuki from KEMRI, which was "Never waste a crisis." And that set the tone for today's symposium. So from that, he explained that COVID was an opportunity for think tanks to take a step back and reassess their modes of operation, and also leverage on the opportunities that COVID has presented to think tanks and also to institutions across the board. Then he mentioned that also as the environment has changed within which think tanks are currently operating, think tanks must also evolve to meet those changes within the operating environment. Then the various think tanks also provided us with examples of how their research processes have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, by the inability to interact with their intended respondents or the subjects due to, first of all, the government restrictions that were put in place, but also the need for them to mitigate the risk of infection. So this prompted and informed a change within those institutions in the research tools, their research processes, the data collection tools, research methods, and also modes of publication and dissemination. Then this also prompted the researchers within those institutions to shift from, for example, in-person data collection, which were the traditional methods of data collection and the ones that they had routinely been used to remote data collection. So we had examples of institutions providing or putting in place mechanisms to ensure their continuity of working, ensuring the sustainability of their own internal livelihood, also developing guidelines for their staff to work from home, also facilitating their staff and researchers to work remotely, and providing mechanisms to be able to relate and contact participants. Other institutions also provided examples of how they retooled their research process by reviewing, for example, the effectiveness of their data collection methods, while still trying to maintain the objectivity and compliance with the ethics in the research process, especially in the context of a pandemic. So this included, for example, mitigating risks to their staff and their researchers, and also maintaining objectivity and quality in their research processes. So institutions developed various mechanisms to manage remote research, as well as develop capacity in online data collection. So nonetheless, in spite of the challenges that were posed by COVID-19, the various presenters and discussants noted that it provided an opportunity for think tanks and policymakers to become more adaptive. However, being adaptive also behoves think tanks to be adaptive in how they conduct their research, also in the issues they consider, in the type of research that they undertake, the process of research that they use, and also whom they engage with. So for this, it was noted that it's important for think tanks to understand the various policy issues that they're undertaking, and also the kind of evidence requirements that their decision makers or policy makers within that sector require. And for this, it was noted that it's important for think tanks to provide to policy makers and decision makers with credible and actionable evidence. Then the role of technology also came across very strongly, and it was noted that it was very critical, especially to think tanks, in ensuring the continuity of their research processes. However, it was observed that in as much as you're using technology, various considerations still need to be made, such as which technology should be used, are the participants or respondents you're targeting able to access or use the technology and applications? Do they have digital literacy? And also, how do you safeguard the data protection and privacy issues? Other issues that came think tanks not to lose sight of exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Then it was also noted that in as much as, yes, COVID-19 was a global disaster with devastating effects worldwide, we still need to consider the other prevailing public health issues that currently exist, such as HIV, TB, malaria, and reproductive health, that still require the attention of public health experts, public health workers, and researchers. Therefore, the research agenda within the various think tanks should not be abandoned, and we must still provide room to consider these other prevalent policy issues. It was also emphasized that the voice of think tanks and researchers needs to come out stronger, where we need to speak as one voice. And this emanated from an observation or a concern that researchers are not listed as essential services. And this is an issue because if the objective is to make our research be adaptive to situations of crisis, then the research needs to be time sensitive, and therefore considerations of including researchers as essential services should also be taken up. Then it was highlighted that think tanks at times tend to work in a narrow space, and this could at times be because they are mainly narrowed to a specific sector or a specific theme that they focus on within their mandate. And this has at times affected the seamless working across think tanks. However, this can be overcome by encouraging and promoting partnerships and cross-sectoral activities. And overall, for this session, it was noted that think tanks need to be more creative and innovative in their structures, activities, and modes of operation. Then the next session was on capacity development and knowledge management in the COVID-19 area. The various presenters observed that in their various training and capacity development institutions, they were required to change to e-mode of delivery, and also their dissemination methods were also affected by the pandemic. And the pandemic also led to reduced funding and budgetary allocation for some of the institutions for their capacity building and research activities. Then for this, recommendations that were made was that it's important to ensure that dissemination of policies are easily consumable and also digestible by the public. And proposals were made for translation of policies to local dialect. Also, capacity building should go hand in hand with creating awareness to ensure uptake and use of the research products that think tanks develop. It was also proposed that there should be inclusive planning in all sectors and spheres of development, which should be entrenched. Also, the academia and senior faculty must focus more on picking brighter and smarter instructors, as well as investing in training the people who are expected to deliver the trainings themselves, as researchers may have the knowledge, but may not necessarily have the skills to impart the knowledge to their target audience. On the session for communication, lobbying, and advocacy during COVID-19 era, the presenters noted that they witnessed a change in how people and the public are able to relate to government, and this has prompted think tanks to revisit how to bridge the gap between research and the end user or the intended user of that research. And in view of this, it's become important for think tanks to not just consider the decision makers or policy makers when developing policy proposals, but to also consider the public itself to ensure that their research is responsive to the people who need it the most. Then the presenters also highlighted the need to ensure policies are able to be turned into action, and we need to maintain the 4 R's, that is research, a reputation of excellence, relationships, and relevance. So think tanks were encouraged to use their expertise and evidence to empower policymakers. And this should include how think tanks can empower policymakers on how they make decisions, how they use their data, and also how they communicate or package their policies. The presenters also noted that policies therefore need to be packaged in a manner that can easily be digested and understood by the public or target audience. And it's also important for the public or the end users to understand the policy proposals that are being imposed on them. And an example that was given was for the stay-at-home orders. So it's important for think tanks and also policymakers to provide mechanisms for better outreach to the public.
Then the presenters also recommended that it's critical for think tanks to develop effective communication tools, as well as adapt the new way of consuming information that the public is now increasingly moving towards. And think tanks, in view of this, need to invest more in communication and media. Also, an observation was that more needs to be done by think tanks in terms of lobbying. For example, through provision to submit legislative proposal, indicating the position of think tanks in response to a certain bill, so that we can ensure that think tanks have a common voice within the policy-making space. Then a key highlight was on ensuring relevance of research conducted by think tanks and ensuring that our research is aligned to and are cognizant of the policy cycle to be able to empower think tanks to actually set the agenda and provide timely solutions. On the last session for reforming public policy and legislation during COVID-19 era, we were given an overview on the legal frameworks that were primarily used during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that included our substantive legislation, that's the Public Health Act and the Public Order Act. And it was noted that these were the main enabling legislations that were used to develop the ensuing subsidiary legislation, and that majority of the laws were actually subsidiary legislation which emanated from those two main acts. So we're taken through a number of regulations and legal notices which were enacted across a number of sectors to cushion the economy from the negative socioeconomic effects of the pandemic, as well as contain and mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 disease. So the presenters also discussed the adequacy of the Public Health Act, and it was noted that yes, the Public Health Act was very adequate in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, because despite having a pandemic of this nature for the first time, we did not have to substantially review our legislation or enact or establish an entirely new legislative framework. So the Public Health Act and Public Order Act were able to provide the necessary enabling legal and institutional infrastructure to respond to the public health emergency brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, the Public Health Act definitely provided the overall framework, the powers, responsibilities, and provision of containment measures that could further be developed in the subsidiary legislation. However, it was noted that this act was initially enacted in 1921, and because of this, there's still room to take the opportunity to reform the Public Health Act to ensure it's able to meet the current needs and demands of the public health sector, as well as emerging public health concerns. Then we're also taken through a number of initiatives and measures by the judiciary in collaboration with other actors in the legal sector, I think through the National Council on Administration of Justice, which put in place a raft of measures to ensure access to justice while still protecting the public, judicial officers, and litigants from COVID-19. And it was noted that the COVID-19 actually provided the impetus for the judiciary to strengthen the e-filing system, reduce handling of paperwork, also promote virtual hearings, although this faced some challenges on the interface of the application that was being utilized. So one of the reasons was that perhaps the digitization aspect may have caught the legal sector off guard. However, it has now provided an opportunity for the sector to prioritize uptake in technology. A key recommendation was that it is critical that we prepare legislation that is implementable and also fit for purpose. And We also need legitimacy to support our policies and laws. In addition to this, citizen oversight and oversight responsibility make laws work, but it also requires further support from leadership. Lastly, in ensuring rule of law, it's important to ensure that the law applies equally to all, to complement or ensure effective implementation and enforcement of the laws and regulations that have been developed. This would also enhance compliance among citizenry and confidence in the legal and governance systems. So in conclusion, the overall sentiments was that global problems and challenges such as COVID-19 go beyond and transcend national borders and therefore require a collective, intersectoral and multidisciplinary approach. Think tanks therefore need to be open, collaborative, engaging, and also consider commonalities in terms of approach. So the aspects of partnership and cross-sectoral collaboration and cooperation must be embraced through forums such as these ones, which it was recommended that think tanks as well as policymakers should have more of. And it was emphasized by the sentiment that we work best if we work together. Overall, think tanks need to be creative, innovative, and also advocate for the requisite reforms required for us to build back better. Thank you, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Vavale, for that very comprehensive summary of the issues. You really worked very hard to be able to summarize those issues. And we appreciate every participant, every discussant, every presenter who was here. I'm sure when the report is written and the summary is made, it will be shared by everyone here. We want to close, and I want to ask Eliud to give a vote of thanks for everyone so that we can be able to close. Eliud, please.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. And I know for all of us, it has been a long day, but a very productive day. From the Kenya Think Tanks Forum and also from KIPRA, we want to appreciate first and foremost the CAS, Dr. Eric Wafuho. I just checked and he's still logged on. He's still in the meeting since morning. And I think this is quite exceptional. Thank you for slicing off the whole of your day just to be with us and to listen to the discussions that we have had today as Kenya think tanks and also our stakeholders. So thank you for opening the meeting for us, and thank you for being so gracious with your words of wisdom that allowed us to move on with this event. I want also to acknowledge and thank the KIPRA Board of Directors, and I've seen quite a number of them joined this event, and they have been with us. Asante sana, Dr. Dina Samikwo, Professor Michael Chege, Dr. Phoebe Josia, Director Lakina, Director Rose Rono. Thank you so much. We know it has been a tiring day for you, but I also know that the board has been very supportive to our partnership with Kenya Think Tanks, and that is why you have allowed us to use the KIPRA infrastructure and KIPRA resources to host this event. And we want to thank you for being so generous to the Kenya Think Tanks Forum. Now, I also want to thank the Executive Director and my colleagues at KIPRA who have supported this, especially the ICT department and the communications department that have actually made sure that this engagement is actually relayed to our stakeholders wherever they are. They have been connecting us and giving us the technical support. We have not been able to see them on the front line, but they are the backliners. And so I think they are our essential services for this event. And we want to thank you for that contribution. And they have, my colleagues have also been part of this process. Now, we had a small planning team of Kenya think tanks. We had from Horn Institute, we had Dr. Hassan, Mr. Joel, and then from Calro, we had Dr. Wellington Molinge. The Center of Parliamentary Studies, we had Peter Mushira, Judith Kiprop, Dr. George Waka, Abdi Abdo. And then from the 254 Youth Policy CAF, we had Dennis Kialo, we had Judith Nguli and Samantha Luceno. And then from Kemri Welcome Trust, we had Alex Njero. That is the small team that put together all this. They are the brains behind this symposium, and we want to thank them for the tireless efforts. We have had so many meetings trying to make this event a reality, and we appreciate that effort. And you will agree with me that the presenters did a nice job, starting with Kemri. We had a presentation from Prof. We had a presentation from Dr. Frida, and then we had a presentation from Rachel, and those presentations were quite instructive. Thank you for taking time to prepare very good presentations. Some of you made it at very short notice and with a lot of limitations. And so we appreciate your support and the effort you put in. Of course, the discussants also added a lot of flavor to the discussions, a lot of insight. We want to thank you for your expertise. And we know that we are not going very near. We are going very far as a Kenya Think Tanks Forum. And then we also had moderators. We want to thank you. And then you participants. This event has been very successful because it has actually been you exceeded our expectations. We had so many participants, I guess because of technology, and you have made this event a very successful event. And I think in the calendar for Kenya Think Tanks Forum, this is exceptional. And we want to thank you for sitting since morning up to now, some of you without lunch and some of you without tea, but you have been able to give your contributions. And as you have seen from the summary of the proceedings, we have actually captured a lot of things that will carry us forward. Now, as KIPRA, we want to assure you that we are committed to this process. The first proceedings report for the 2019 Kenya Think Tank Symposium will be out shortly. It's just being finalized, rolling out on the printing press. We will be sharing with the members, I think, when it is ready. And then this report for this event will also be processed just like the first one. And also we shall be sharing with the members. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I wish to return the baton to the overall moderator to direct us on the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eliud. And I don't think I have much to hand. Only to appreciate the work that has gone into this workshop, symposium, and also to appreciate sitting for 9 hours is not very easy. We started with the prayer, and we would like to close with a prayer so that everyone will be able to leave at their pleasure. So we have Dennis to lead us into the closing prayer. Dennis?
Thank you, Laichena. To everybody, let us believe and pray. Thank you, Lord, for this wonderful time that you are going to us. We thank you for the wonderful deliberations that we have had the whole day during today's symposium. Thank you even for bringing us together to share different ideas and ideologies on how to move forward as think tanks. We pray as we go forward to sit back and think through what we have discussed, and more importantly, implement it. We ask that you may guide us and give us your wisdom. We also ask that you may help us touch the lives of the very citizens who rely on the knowledge that we generate. And we do pray that, believing and trusting in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Dennis. The guests are pressure to leave, and thank you very much. We have kept time. Bye-bye, all of you. See you till I see you again in another forum like this.
Thank you, guys. It's been a long
Thank
day.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Keep
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.